Hi, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. We're just waiting for people to connect, and then we will be starting in about 30 seconds. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Helen Mussard, and I'm CMO for IAB Europe, and I am delighted to kick off our first event today, which is part of our Trust and Transparency series that we're going to be hosting across September. And within this session today, we're going to be looking at how targeted advertising works and who really benefits. So I'm delighted to be joined by our programmatic consultant, Andrew Hayward-Wright, who is also Partnerships Director for SeenThis. Drew will be giving a 15-minute presentation to help people truly understand how personalized advertising works and the benefits it brings to people and publishers. And then he'll be joined by an expert group of panelists to discuss best practices within their own companies and also at an industry level. We are live this morning and we're going to be recording this session. We'll share it with everyone afterwards. And because we are live, it means that you've got a unique experience to ask the panel or Andrew any questions you may have. So at the very bottom of your screen, you'll see that there's a chat box and there's also a Q&A box. So please place any questions into there, and then Drew will take those throughout his session with the panel and then also at the very end as well. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Andrew.
Excellent. Thank you, Helen. And thank you everyone for joining and listening in today. So I'll just share my screen. Yeah, there we go. All right. Okay, so if we start off, obviously Programmatic 101 and looking at the digital advertising marketplace and the use of data within it. Now, I'm sure everyone's seen a Lumascape before, but I thought it would be a bit better to actually map out what our marketplace looks like. And importantly, our digital publishing is an ad-funded economy. So we obviously have the users on the right and the publishers, and then the advertisers and the agencies on the left. The user's incentive or objective is to engage with meaningful content that is kind of hassle-free and non-intrusive in the sense of its user experience. And the advertisers on the left, their objective is to reach those users, drive engagement and drive marketing ROI. And then the publishers in the middle of the two, obviously their objective there is to drive sustainable revenue growth to ensure that their publishing efforts remain free and open to those users. So all kind of interconnected. And then within that this marketplace, obviously the rise of programmatic, we have our SSP or supply side partners and our DSP demand side partners. And these are the two entities that are running the exchange and interacting and enabling this transaction of digital advertising. And importantly, within programmatic, we've kind of accelerated this move towards addressable and targetable audiences. So we have seen the rise of obviously data management platforms, CDPs, and other data tools that are used. But importantly, what we want to stress here is that these entities and technologies remain separate from the actual transaction and aren't actually passing any information in that bid request and transaction. So let's look at kind of a high level of what the real-time bidding process or the how targeted advertising works a little bit. So every time a user comes to a site, there is an ad opportunity generated. This all happens in a couple of milliseconds, hundreds of milliseconds. The publisher announced to the SSP the availability of an ad slot. This is passed over to the DSP in what's called an ad request. And then the DSP is looking at certain targeting criteria within its own data sets. Now, as I mentioned, this request is not actually passing any data itself, it's just passing identifiers and cookies, and we'll go into that in a little bit. And it is the job of the DSP or any agencies and advertisers to look at their known audiences and understand, is this impression relevant to my advertising campaign? Can it help me fulfill my objectives and targets? Once that's the decision is made, the bid response is passed back to the SSPs, the highest bid is announced to the ad server, and then we have the arrangement of the ad fulfilled within the publisher's site. There's a very high level example of how an ad request works, but kind of touching on the different touch points and entities that are involved along the way of programmatic request. So I touched on how the process kind of works, again, at a very high level, because there's so many different ways in which exchanges work. But what I wanted to stress here is that the process in which personalized data is used within digital advertising. Now, at the heart of all the decision processes, we have to have consent and choice. So this is something like, you will all be aware of the TCF, or the Transparency Consent Framework, and you'll have seen the cookie banners that are coming up on publishers' websites, but it can also be in the form of consent, where a user gives their email address to log in some personal information that is stored on their behalf in relation to them understanding what it's being used for, how it's being used, and why it's being used. The next part is the storage. Now, as I mentioned, the storage of this data is separate to the actual transaction and ad request and actual exchange between the SSP and the DSP. So this is where we have those data silos of your DMPs or your CRM systems, and connecting an advertiser's view of their user and audience so that they can transact upon it in real time and make sure that their audience is addressable, relevant, and the creative storytelling is delivered at the right time and the right place and the right context. Now we move a step further across, and this depends on the kind of transaction or the identity that's being used. So we're all aware of cookie IDs or cookies, but now there's a rising trend of ID solutions or identity solutions. Now it's important to understand that all of the IDs or cookies that are passed in an ad request are anonymized strings of either letters, digits, or specific symbols. So it's not being passed out in an ad request, Andrew Hayward-Wright at IAB Europe.eu. It's 1234 hash ABCD. So the only way in which a buyer can interact or use that cookie or that ID is if they either have a key or they understand or have a cookie match. It's what they do after that that is the targeting and addressability. So they're then seeing that key or identity. They're saying, okay, yes, I have ID 12345 in my taxonomy. What is my view of that person? What data do I have of that person? It's then made the decision, okay, this is relevant to my campaign. It does not broadcast back any information through the supply chain or the ad response. It simply is broadcasting back its intent to purchase that impression and the price in which it wants to do so at. So let's look at how the world is kind of changing. We've touched on what's done in the ad request and how digital advertising and audience targeting works. But obviously we're in this transition phase, and third-party cookies in themselves have been kind of imperfect all along in a way. But I wanted to stop and just take a moment to really reflect on the obviously recent announcement of Google's extension and of removing third-party cookies. The reason I think that Google tends to take a little bit longer amongst the complexity of their technology and setup is this chart on the screen now. Chrome represents 63.2% of all browser usage. So when they make a change, it's much more impactful to our industry, and it can be severely prohibitive if the change is not considered and thought out for many businesses. So it's kind of why we see them take a longer approach, that there's more due diligence needed, and sometimes they're not first movers just because of the widespread impact. They have obviously social responsibility, but also a responsibility to the marketplace to help the industry move forward. Going back to third-party cookies and how they've kind of been imperfect all along. Well, third-party cookies were actually developed about 25 years ago, and they were never intended to be used for advertising. They were more around measurement, development stats, But what they've enabled is this creep function that I'm sure we're all kind of aware of, whereby you're going to a shoe shop and then all of a sudden 2 weeks later, even though you bought the shoe, you might be seeing that advert for the said shoe. They've had a decentralized evolution where they've come from to form the backbone of browser and ad targeting, identity resolution and measurement and personalization, but they've taken on personalities and development from all of those sectors. They've also, the use and application of them have been developed by varying different companies. So we've had this decentralization of their use. As I've stressed before, a cookie does not equal a person. It's a text file placed on a single web browser on a single device for advertising. If the person switches browsers or devices, the link between the cookie and user is lost. So we can start to see the longevity and the use of them for this cross-device targeting or sequential storytelling can be limited. And the last one to be aware of is obviously post-browser web. So the rise of non-based interaction, so non-browser based interaction, so this might be via voice technology or Internet of Other Things, mobile apps as well, reduces the number of consumers at touch points we can actually use for cookies. So these are just a few reasons why actually the evolution that our industry is going through is something that we probably needed with or without the catalyst of GDPR and the removal of third-party cookies being pushed by the browsers. There were kind of an imperfect solution to our addressable advertising industry. I just wanted to make a clarification point as well on what cookieless is. So when we talk about the cookie apocalypse, we're talking about the deprecation of third-party cookies only. So difference, obviously, for those that don't know, the difference between first-party and third-party cookies is first-party cookie is set by the domain owner. So it could be theguardian.com setting a cookie on theguardian.com, whereas a third-party cookie or a cross-site cookie is a third party setting a cookie on a different domain. So it could be the trade desk setting a cookie on theguardian.com as an example. They have slightly different uses as well. So often first-party cookies are used for remembering passwords, historic analytics on the site, and also important for website owners to understand the performance of their site and what's going on. Whereas third-party cookies are used to kind of track overall history of online behavior across multiple domains to build up that kind of profile. And they're typically used by ad tech vendors and the third-party targeting companies. If we look towards the future and sort of setting the tone for the next conversation on the panel around privacy in digital advertising and transparency, there are kind of 5 core pillars of what is next within our industry. So starting on the left with logged in users, a very deterministic and known identity where the user is signing in, providing certain details. There might be a value trade such as access to extra content, or it might just be that they decide that they want to have a login so that they have an account across multiple sites. This is going to be a very small proportion of the addressable or identifiable audience, estimated at the moment around 5%, likely to grow to 10 to 15%, depending on the adoption of certain single sign-on solutions like the Trade Desk Unified ID. We move across to shared IDs, and these are ID graph built on ID graphs. They're managed by specific identity companies. They're required by the publisher to integrate them on page. So much more control than the world of cookie, where anyone was able to set a cookie on a domain or a user's device. These are going to have an integration onto a publisher's page, controlled. And as I mentioned, the only people who are going to be accessing them are those that have the key on the other side and understand what these IDs mean. Moving over a bit further, we've got publisher segments. As I said, first-party cookies are not going away. This means that publishers can build out robust first-party data segments based on behavioral activities on their site, potentially combining them with known logged-in users to build robust pictures of who their user set are. It presents an opportunity for publishers to further engage with the buy-side advertisers and agencies to help them curate the correct inventory so that the return on investment for marketing campaigns is a lot better. Moving into the world of anonymous, we have flocks and other cohorting initiatives. So cohorting is talking about 1,000 or more users who the buyer or seller don't know who the user individual. So we're moving from individuals to averages in this world. They'll just understand certain characteristics, and it'll take a test and learn approach to understand what is going on here. We've obviously had the Google Origin trials or the Flock Origin trials that have been pushed back a little bit in that roadmap to figure out any privacy implications and deployment and feasibility within the market. And then moving finally across to pure anonymous in the world of contextual, we've started to see a resurgence of contextual-based solutions in the form of what's known as VANs or vertical ad networks, where there's a curation of similar content so that a buyer knows exactly what context they're buying in. They can have confidence that it's potentially brand safe, correct, they can infer audience characteristics from it, and have a slightly more anonymous way of targeting a user group or context group. All of this is going to be underpinned by machine learning, which raises another question around generating inference and users' rights to fair inference by AI and machine learning. A couple of identifier types and further categorization. So we have what's called persistent or transient. So persistent means existing across browsing sessions, enabling the link of actions such as attributes or frequency caps, versus a transient one-time identifier that expires on the site, cannot be used across multiple domains. And then deterministic and probabilistic, just to re-clarify them, is how a user is categorized. So deterministic is declared by the user. So this is going to be your logged in user information where they're declaring their name, potentially their age and other characteristics. Whereas probabilistic is inferred based on other information relating to the identifier. So this might be their IP address, their browser type, their device type, their potential geolocation. They're not specific about the user. There are other data points that can help you infer and figure out who they might be. A quick overview of a non-exhaustive overview of the industry. As you can see, there's lots of different identity solutions underway. We're kind of watching as the test and learn approach kind of happens, but you've got the kind of publisher-led through to ad tech specific and a few hybrid solutions in there as well. A last final point on the whole identity and the drive forwards. One thing that we do need to be careful of is obviously we're constantly working towards this notion of a centralized media strategy. However, due to the different mediums that we're seeing rise, in particular obviously CTV and digital audio, we're starting to see decentralized approaches of identity solutions. So it's something in the background that we obviously need to be aware of. That if we want to be able to keep a centralized media strategy, we need to find a way to ensure that we're not creating a decentralized media adoption with different IDs that aren't connected together. So as a final sort of maybe to-do list or thoughts before we jump into the panel, marketeers need to move away from gathering unknown first-party IDs towards known first-party IDs. We should start looking and building repositories of those known identities, but in a compliant manner. So always thinking consent has to be at the center of everything that we do. And we should then take those and run models on data connected to business objectives. So for example, when I'm talking about business objectives, I'm talking about the chart on the right. So your revenue metrics, your engagement metrics, your paid acquisition metrics to improve the performance of our addressable and audience targeting over time. So with that, thank you very much. And I will stop sharing and we'll get the panel up on stage. And as they join us up on stage, so today I'm joined by Christie, who's the Head Policy and Regulatory Affairs at IAB UK, Elena, who is the Senior Compliance Director, Legal and Privacy at Adform, and Julien, who's Staff Systems Architect at Xandr. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today and talk about transparency and trust within digital advertising and the use of data. I thought before we jump into sort of the technical or policy questions, it would be great if we go through and kind of talk about what is trust and transparency in relation to privacy and data within digital advertising, because there's obviously different aspects of it. So I might start with you, Julien, if that's okay. Oh, Julien, can you hear us?
Yes, sorry, I'm back.
That's all right. So just say we start with what is trust and transparency in relation to privacy and the use of data within digital advertising?
Sure. So I think trust and transparency were two of the main pillars that were used to build GDPR and the other regulation around privacy around the world. I think it's an important point because a lot of the other privacy initiatives that we've seen, for example, led by the browsers, have had a very different approach where the main concept behind this approach were not trust and transparency, but it was just preventing data processing, personal data processing altogether. If you look at what Safari did with removing third-party cookies, or what Firefox did, then, or even like the definition of the privacy model for the web that Chrome has put together to start with the Privacy Sandbox project. Those are not talking much about transparency and trust with the users. They're mostly around preventing any personal data processing, specifically cross-domain data processing of the user. While on the other end, what regulators have come up with, again, with GDPR and the other regulation out there, they've never said that cookies, third-party cookies, were fundamentally bad and needed to be removed. They never said that the processing personal data was a bad thing, or targeted advertising was a bad thing. So what they said, though, is that when those things happen, when we ad tech process a user's personal data, whether this is information about his interest, or if it's just like a pseudonymized ID, like you explain, based on the third-party cookies, for example, when those things happen, they need to happen within the user's control, and that also means the user's knowledge, so transparency. What that means is we're still entitled to do those data processing, but we need to make sure that the user will be aware of this, and that's where like consent or legitimate interest and user's disclosure come in play. And also control is where like the user has a chance to actually opt in case of consent for those data processing, or opt out in case of legitimate interest. And that's where like the transparency and consent framework that the industry through IAB came up with is trying to fill those two main pillars, two main needs that have been made clear by regulation and by users' needs. So transparency and consent frameworks really provide an answer for ad tech to be able to work within that, both transparency by providing every information the users need to know, and some will argue that it's maybe too much information, but at least information is there. So TCF provides that information, that level of granularity of information to the users, but it also provides the users with control over what they want to do, which again is fundamental to how regulators and how we envision privacy, and again, which sometimes can diverge a bit from other initiatives. Again, I talk about the browser, but we've seen in some of the propositions from Privacy Sandbox, for example, where there was, let's say, privacy in the sense that personal data will not be able to be processed anymore outside of the browser or anywhere, but the transparency and trust were somewhat lacking sometimes. If you think about FLoC, one of the propositions of the Privacy Sandbox, one of the big concerns that people have raised against FLoC is the complete lack of transparency and control from the user. User had no idea what the FLoC it would be in, or what this FLoC would mean, so no transparency, and you will have very no too little control over it, like only an opt-in, opt-out completely, but no ability to work within that flock ID to make it more in line with what he wants, what he likes. So again, like trust and transparency, I think are two pillars of our regulation with regard to privacy, and I think they are definitely something that we need to take into consideration to whichever solution we're going to be working with to process users' personal data and do digital advertising.
Absolutely, makes sense. Elena?
So I think I will translate, thank you very much. I will translate Julien's summary, technical, modern technical into legal language. It's contained in the letter of the law, specifically in the GDPR, that any processing of personal data should be lawful and fair, and that is so to call out some of the main aspects that the transparency principle requires. They all amount to the fact that it should be transparent to the natural persons, users, such as us navigating throughout the internet, that personal data concerning them, what is the personal data that is collected, how it is used, and to what extent will that data be processed. That information and communication has to be conveyed in an easy and easy to understand and accessible way. It has to be conveyed in a clear and plain language, and it has to be disclosed to the data subject, the identity of the controllers of the parties that are engaged in any processing. And so this all can be achieved, as already Julien has called out, through various consent frameworks, and specific, be it proprietary solutions or be it industry standards, such as the transparency and consent framework that the IAB has put together with the other industry players. And what we see in particular when it comes to trust and transparency, so trust that cannot exist without the transparency. So it's a prerequisite, transparency is a prerequisite in order to build consumers' trust, and that can be achieved through those kind of like standard frameworks or even proprietary frameworks that publishers or advertisers are building, and when it comes to collecting the user consent, informing the users how their data is going to be processed and to what extent their data is going to be used for the purpose of digital advertising.
Makes sense. So trust trust without transparency, basically. So we have to have that transparency first. So, and Christie, what are your thoughts on this? We've kind of touched as well on, obviously we're talking B2C right now. Is there an element of B2B, like business to business requirement of trust and transparency?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would agree with what Julien and Elena have said so far. I think the key is trusted relationships. So I think that applies both on the business side as well as the audience side. So it's, in both cases, there's kind of common tenets of that. I think on the business side, it's definitely about using data responsibly with trusted partners. And obviously that benefits both on the consumer side, but also on the business side as well. So it's important that, the stakes are really high when it comes to processing personal data, and for a good reason. There's strict compliance requirements in place. And so it's really important, if you're operating in this space, that that you can trust the partners that you're working with to do the right thing with the data, and to respect the rules that we all have to follow. And obviously that's why we have the TCF, and it's why it plays such an important role in that. And I think that plays out then back into the consumer trust, of course, which others have talked about. So I won't kind of go over that too much, but the control has to be meaningful. And so actually people want to know that we will follow through in practice with what we will say we will do with their data, so that we are fair in what we do with it and trustworthy in what we do with their data, and respecting their choices as well.
Excellent. So let's jump into kind of demystifying some common misconceptions around what is exactly collected and shared throughout the digital, but also programmatic transaction. I know, Elena, you've had some interesting insights, so maybe we'll start with you.
That's correct. I think there is a misconception among even average educated users as what is the data that is collected about them when they navigate throughout the internet. And a misconception, because I've had various talks either in the context of contract negotiations or even privately, given my my role and my extensive experience in this space. And what I've seen is that users, private users, they have the misconception where they believe that vendors and publishers and brands, they collect dozens and amounts, like huge amounts of data, and process that unfairly or store it for like longer period of times. And I trust, where I believe there are also bad players in this market, but the place I'm speaking from a good player perspective. So I would like to confirm that is not the case. I think we've come a long way at tech. We've come from a very intransparent way of processing data, and you, Andrew, you've called out how the third-party cookies, how they evolved, and with the rise of the GDPR, it has been cleared, and more that space of how the data is processed. And to call out some examples, so, for example, in a bid request, that when a user visits a website and navigate through that website, and that is mostly advertising funded, then there is a bid request that is initiated, and that bid request is then sent to a platform, to a supply side platform, and asking, do you have an advertisement for me, right? That bid request, what that bid request essentially contains is an online identifier. That online identifier can be third party or first party, and third party, as we said, third party means it belongs to a party that is not operating that website where a user is right now visiting. And then together with that online identifier, the SSP and the DSP, the demand side platform, would receive other data points which are probabilistic or inferring certain demographics about the user. Together with the online identifier, we may receive also the IP address, which is, however, in a truncated form, and that is essential for users to understand. And so to call out the online identifier, the truncated IP address, and then when it comes to demographics, we have here data such as, do we infer about this user being a female or a male, given the content of the website or the page it reads, also the location, the various technical information with respect to the device that the user is accessing that website. And all of this information, it is processed in order to infer, what are the user's preferences, and then so that the supply side platform and the demand side platform can deliver and add and target that user with a specific preference that we have inferred about that user. Here is the holy grail of inferring certain information with respect to users lays down in the machine learning algorithms that vendors, DSPs and SSPs have developed, and that is why it's important from that perspective to work on data minimization principle, so that those algorithms always take into consideration data minimization, so that not too many data points are collected and processed. Plus, data retention is an essential part of that processing, so that for how long that data is stored. And to give an example, we operate on the basis of 60 days retention period. So, and we've learned from our advertisers that they want to know, and they want to have users' data that is actual, that is current, and not all data. That is why 60 days, we believe it's been within the boundaries of, it's a reasonable period of time, looking into even shortening that period of retention. So I think those are essential. To summarize, those are the data points that are collected and processed together with the various data minimization and data retention mechanisms that we have in place to ensure that data is not stored forever, that data is not processed unreasonably, and we do not collect data just on a nice to have basis, but simply what the user has authorized us to do through the various consent mechanisms when visiting a certain page.
Excellent. And Christie, from your perspective, from a policy and privacy perspective, have certain things come up around misconceptions in the industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a challenge we've faced for a long time when we talk to regulators and policymakers, that they don't necessarily understand technically how digital advertising works. That's understandable. They're not sector experts. But yeah, it's a challenge that we fully recognise, and we spend a lot of time trying to make sure that we educate and explain to policymakers and regulators exactly how we use information, and the kinds of things that both Elena and yourself were talking about, that, you know, this isn't sending information that this is personally me and this particular address, and, you know, yesterday I did X, Y, and Z. But there are misconceptions, and I think that kind of it opens the way sometimes for people who are concerned about data use to, I guess, almost perpetuate some of those myths. You know, if they think, and there are plenty of people who kind of, you know, consumer advocates who believe that too much data is processed, and unfortunately, where there is a kind of a vacuum, then you know, misinformation can thrive, and so it's really important, I think, that we are open and transparent and keep on working on those conversations to really explain what's going on. It's a tricky thing to do because there's obviously a lot of technical detail, and it's hard to get the balance right, but I think we do need to continue to work on that, being much more open actually about what data is used and what data isn't used as well. I think you touched on some of those things yourself, Drew, and I think sort of challenging some of those myths is really important for us as we face a lot of kind of regulatory and policy challenges now as a sector, and I think we mustn't assume that other people have got the same level of knowledge, and it's really important that we kind of start with some of that foundational facts and knowledge building to try to build our arguments on.
Absolutely, education is key with regulators. Yeah,
if I may add one more thing, so what is because I think that brings a little bit more academic speaking, or more reality into and exemplifying. So we've observed a uptake of requests, data subject access requests, and then what does this mean? So it means we have to provide with the user with what is the data that we have on our system, that we stored on our system for the past. And here it's visible, and it's confirming that what we have on file, what we process, are the online identifier, is the truncated IP address, is the approximate location of the user, meaning the country, and that is based on, we can provide, for example, a user with this kind of information when the user gives us the cookie ID that it has to be taken from the browser. And in addition to that, we also see, like what we also provide the user would be, what would be the segments that user is attached to within our system. But at no point in time we have such direct personal data that I think most of the users and consumers believe that that is processed within digital advertising. That might be different in social media, I think, but from the place where I am as a working as a company for a vendor that is is offering services to advertisers to market their products on websites and mobile applications. This is what we have, and this is what we process. And we focus on processing only consent-based data.
Excellent. Yeah, that brings more context to even users still don't fully understand what is going on, right? So when they're making those subject service requests, they're possibly expecting a much more in-depth profile. And I guess it's the job of us in the industry to clarify that for regulators, users, and probably other people in the industry who aren't as close to the targeting advertising. Julien, your thoughts on misconceptions and in targeting and digital advertising?
Yeah. So yeah, just to echo Elena and Christie's point, I definitely agree. Like there is general misconception about what kind of data we have access to. But I think like the misconception about digital advertising goes way beyond just data being used. It goes like to what digital advertising is and what does it empowers, like the internet in general. And I think like the industry has to do we have to do a better job at educating the people about this. I also think that this misconception is, to Elena's point, mostly, in my opinion, due to social, like walled garden, where usually the user will move into an ecosystem where the social media will have a much better knowledge of this user. Like the user will actually be logged in. It will have provided deterministic information about him, such as first name, last name, email address. And therefore, yes, those walled garden have this kind of access to the user's privacy. And even them, I'm sure, are using a lot of mechanisms to minimize the data they use about the user. But they do, at some point, have access to all this data, which is where, and we've seen like, in mainstream, like even on Netflix, I remember seeing this movie about how the data from users was being used, like how the social media were spying on people and stuff like this. And obviously, these kind of phenomena, they feed into user sphere. But what people need to remember is that outside of those walled garden, where they logged in, when they provided those personal information, such as name, last name, on the open web, where we operate for the most of us, we operate, such information is not available. Like I think today, the percentage of open web where users are actually logged in is below 10%. So it means that 90% of the time when a user goes on the web and has not provided his email address, his name, his last name, like we won't have this level of information. We will only operate on the basis of pseudonymous ID, which will be like just a randomized identifiers that we assign to the user within a third-party cookie, and that's the kind of all the level of information about the user will have, and we'll have information attached to that pseudonymous ID, but not to the user directly. So I think the difference between open web and walled garden is also one big source of this misconception.
Makes sense. Yeah. So almost a decoupling and separation of the narratives from social walled garden to the rest of the open web is needed. Before we go on to the next question, actually, there's a question from the audience, which actually I think is quite relevant to what we're talking about. And Julien, I might get you to take this because you briefly mentioned it at the start. So the question is, are alternative IDs non-compliant with the privacy measures of Apple or Google? For example, use of IP address seems to be against what Apple is saying, Safari is saying within the privacy relay.
Yeah, so it's a good question, and indeed it echoes to the point that I was making earlier about there is like the definition of privacy that regulators have made, in which like personal data processing is not forbidden. It is subject to limitation and constraint, but is perfectly legally doable. And as such, like the universal IDs are, as long as they're made and done with the level of transparency and control that is required by regulation, are perfectly viable options. And this vision of the privacy that regulators have put together in the form of GDPR and the other regulations diverge from the vision of privacy that some independent actors, Apple and Google that were mentioned here, are trying to push, whereas they're trying to go much further than what regulators have been asking for. They're trying to prevent personal data processing altogether, kind of. So Google Ad, so the ad tech platform, has already been mentioned that they will not support, entertain those universal ID solutions, at least in their DSP platform. Like, buyers will not be able to leverage those solutions to target individual users across domains. Apple has recently made some announcement about some new features that they will be part of ITP. The way they already remove third-party cookies, disable third-party cookies in Safari, and the other tracking prevention mechanism that they're using. As part of those, there are some of the features that will try to private relay, for example, which was mentioned here, will hide the user's IP address behind kind of a wall, so that a website or an ad tech provider will no longer have access to the user's IP address, not even a truncated version of the IP address. This kind of feature will indeed limit the ability of some solutions to work out, like solutions that are used mostly on like probabilistic solutions that you explained a bit earlier, that are using some of the users' browsing information, such as the IP address, will be limited by such new feature. But universal IDs that are using the email address are not impacted by this specific feature. No, there was another feature part of those new ITP from Apple, which was hide my email, where the idea was for users to be able to register on a website, but by providing a one-time email address generated automatically by Apple, by the browser. This feature from Apple would indeed like make it harder for those ID solutions based on the email address to work. But right now, this feature is very, very limited. It will be only for Apple users that pay an iCloud Plus account. So it will be limited. On the Google side, there are a few proposals that are looking into limiting access to fingerprinting information in general, IP address and others. There are also like web login, which are also trying to make access to the user's email address harder to get. But I don't think I would call them non-compliant. Like I would not call universal ID non-compliant with the browsers. I just say that this is definitely not going in the sense of those browsers' vision of privacy. And I think like it's not just a reason of privacy. There is also like own interest of those browsers, of those company behind the scene that are motivating the way they're approaching privacy, which goes a bit against universal ID. That said, I don't think universal ID are doomed to disappear at some point.
Yeah,
I think there is an opportunity for them.
Makes sense. It's like we have to be careful to separate technical changes to regulatory policy changes and actually what was intended by GDPR and other privacy acts as well in the marketplace. Conscious of time, and we should get to some best practices for everyone to have a think about. So if we think about best practices, there's obviously a company level, what people can do at a company level, but also best practices at an industry level. So Christie, I might start with you on this one. What are some best practices at a company and at the industry level that we can kind of adopt?
Yeah, so I guess from a kind of policy regulatory point of view, if it's directly applicable to you, then adopt the TCF if you haven't done so already. And it's important to flag that TCF covers both GDPR and e-privacy notice and consent. So it's also relevant for advertisers, for example, that they can use it themselves if they're using cookies or collecting data via their sites and their apps. But also, if it's not directly applicable to you, ensure that the partners that you're working with are using it, preferably. If they're not, then obviously you'll need to have in place ways of checking that they are processing data in line with the law. But the TCF is obviously what we'd recommend for that. So use it in whatever way it works for you. And I think, you know, it's important to mention as well that the TCF, it's a protocol, and it sets standards, and it's there to help drive consistency, and that's both on the business side and the consumer side. But there is flexibility in terms of, particularly on the publisher implementation side, in terms of communicating with users about data use and data choices. So I think, you know, it's also important to make sure that best practices are followed there, that there's a really clear communication about why we want to use data. I think that's important for people to understand, and then they can appreciate the choices that are on offer to them, and make their choices with that knowledge of the importance of data for ad-funded media and services.
Excellent. Elena?
Thank you. So here I have, with respect to company level, I can think of, and I would reiterate what Christie was saying, more from a practical perspective, however. So definitely, be it brands or be it publishers, they must review their CMP, their way they collect consent on their website, regardless of if they operate in the context of the first party or first party IDs and type of data they collect. Then second, ensure what is the appropriate framework that governs the respective data collection and processing practices, and to ensure they have trusted partners, and that framework basically speaks, you know, the reality and what the CMP and what the user consent has been provided for. And then third, so the first and the second would only be in vain if there will not be appropriate compliance and auditing and monitoring practices, which those companies, including vendors such as us, do not have in place. And by compliance programs, I mean policing whether the framework is in line with the CMP, and whether the partners you're working with, the clients you're working with, are they collecting the data according to the framework? If so, can that be evidenced? And to give here just a very quick example, we've just run, and we're still in the middle of conducting such a audit and monitoring program with the publishers and advertisers, and we were pleasantly surprised to see that when it comes to what are the solutions, what are the frameworks that our clients are choosing, TCF, the IAB framework solution, is one of the preferred one. And why? Our understanding is because it gives a level of standardization across the EEA market, and this means we all speak the same language. This means we can process the consent signals. This means we can identify the players and the trusted partners within the technical setting, and that gives, I think, it shall give industry hope that standardization is key in order to achieve a high level of compliance and enforcement.
Excellent. And Julien, from your perspective, a few best practices that people can start to adopt.
Yeah, I think like Christie and Elena, I've already said it all, but I guess if there is one point that I want to echo is like in the industry we evolve in, where there are that many actors that need to work together, to interact together. Standardization is key. We cannot have every actor come up with his own solution, with his own way of doing. That is just not practical. And therefore, like solutions such as the TCF or future solutions that the industry is working on, like global privacy frameworks, which will try to address those privacy constraint and obligation, not just for Europe, but across the world, across regulations in a standardized way, will be key for industry to live through privacy time.
Brilliant, excellent. So standardization absolutely at the center, and adopting frameworks, and making sure we're keeping our partners accountable and honest, so that we can be confident in the actions that we're taking and who we're working with. we're going to use all of our time possible. But what do you think after these best practices, if we're looking at digital advertising in the future, right? What are the benefits that you see of kind of personalized targeting, and what are the things that are upcoming in the next couple of months, maybe in the next 6 to 12 months? Elena, shall we start with you?
Absolutely. I think it's, consumer or our clients in this, the clients give or set the trend for us. And we see clients, they want us to reach out to audiences, provided, however, that there is no, provided that, that processing of data is done within the boundaries of the law, and asking us to ensure that the data is not processed breaching that boundary. And speaking of the future, I think we will witness advertisers more and more going for standardization, choosing frameworks and solutions that will ensure that they use the same type of IDs, or they use first-party identifiers that will keep their data within their client silos. And when it comes to first-party IDs, Julien has already called out a couple of examples, but we also see a trend in the market where developing work in development, put it this way, where first-party IDs are going to be highly encrypted, and the connection between an advertiser and a publisher to be a one-on-one within a highly encrypted environment. And the encryption key is subject to or it would be subject to robust privacy practices. And so that cross-site processing that we've seen in the context of third party, it will disappear rather faster than within the next 12 months, my projection. And therefore, I think publishers and advertisers, they must decide what is the first party ID solution they want to use, and to what extent they want to use vendors, and what kind of vendors to use in order to make sure their data is kept safe and within their silos client data.
Excellent. Christie, what's your 60-second take on the future and the benefit?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we've talked a lot. So third-party cookie changes are going to make, cause a lot of changes to how things work now, but fundamentally addressability is still what advertisers want. So yes, how we deliver that is going to look different, but ultimately the aim is still the same. We still want to use data, different kinds of data perhaps, but still use data to find the right people, to create positive advertising experiences, and to deliver business outcomes. So I think it's about, keeping up to speed with what's changing and what the opportunities are going to be in the new landscape, but also remembering, compliance is not going away. We still have to consider data and privacy compliance requirements in however we do things in the future. We talked about first-party cookies will still be around, other kinds of data processing will still be there. And so we still have to remember the user at the heart of that, and we still have to stick to kind of all the things we've talked about today, the need for trust and respect and confidence in the data that we use and ingest in the system. Regulators are going to continue to look closely at the sector, particularly because it's changing, and that's not going away, and nor should it. So I think absolutely we need to change and do things differently, but privacy and compliance is still going to be really key to that. So I think getting ahead of that and understanding what you need to do in a new landscape is going to be really important.
Excellent. And Julien, do you want to close us out with your thoughts?
Sure. So I think first to start with the second part of your question with regard to benefits. I think I'll just echo what you said at the beginning of the presentation, but there is definite benefits behind personalized advertising, whether for the user, we get a better web experience altogether. Like I preferably want to see ads that are relevant to me versus ads for adult diapers, which hopefully I don't need before a couple of years. So I'd rather have a targeted ad experience, is what I say. For advertisers, it's better also to be able to personalize advertising, because they will be able to convey a message that will speak more to the users. For publishers, targeted advertising is also a way for them to better monetize their inventory, to better position their inventory, and therefore to support their business model, to produce more content, which eventually will just like benefit also the users. And for the tech ecosystem in general, like it's benefits just to be able to empower the system. As to the future of it, there are indeed like a lot of things going on, a lot of new initiatives that have been kicked off, mostly due to some of the movement from the browsers with the disappearance of third-party cookies. There will be, I think, not just one solution that will come up and replace third-party cookies. I think like the future is made of several solutions that will each have pros and cons, and that publishers, advertisers, and ad tech mostly will have to learn to work with all of the solutions and use them when it makes sense, and not when it doesn't.
Excellent. There you have it, listeners. Hopefully we've helped to demystify some of the questions around how data is used within digital advertising. And importantly, remember, trust can't exist without transparency. From me, thank you, Christie, Elena, and Julien for taking the time to join us. And with that, I'll hand back to Helen.
Thanks, everyone. I'm
Thank you.
conscious of time. Huge thank you to all of our panelists and especially Drew for this. This is super informative. We have recorded this session, so we'll be sharing it afterwards, and it'll be uploaded this afternoon onto our website. Just like to remind everyone that on Thursday following this, we have our next webinar in our Trust and Transparency series, which will feature our chief economist, Daniel-Neil, and he'll be presenting his new research paper, which will be looking at the wider socio-economic and cultural value of targeted ads. So we hope this session today has been a great foundation, I think, to build on Daniel's findings. So with that, we wish you a lovely afternoon, and we will hopefully see you all on Thursday. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.